Excellent. Well, let's kick things off. Nothing says Tuesday afternoon like civility. Welcome to the Civility and PR Workshop. I'm Amanda Barker, the Deputy Executive Director and Director of Civic Health Programs at Civic Nebraska. Since 2008, Civic Nebraska has created a more modern and robust democracy for all Nebraskans through a variety of initiatives, including youth civic leadership, civic health programs across the state, and our nonpartisan voting rights initiatives. I'm here today with my colleague Steve Smith, our Director of Communications, to really share some thoughts on civil discourse and emphasize why public relations professionals are essential in raising the quality of our personal and public conversations. Steve, do you want to say hello?
Hey everybody! Yeah, thanks for having us today. This is going to be great. As Amanda mentioned, my name is Steve Smith, and I have the honor of sharing Civic Nebraska's stories to the world, and you'll be hearing from me in just a bit. Right now, though, I'd like to give a shout out to our hosts, the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's PRSSA Bateman team. They are otherwise known as the Lincoln Ladies. These exceptional seniors at Nebraska, you are here to tell everyone a little bit more about the Civility Effect, the campaign that their 5-member team has created and rolled out over the past several weeks. And this is a campaign that when they approached us, we were delighted to hear about, and we were really eager to be part of. Hey team.
Hi Steve and Amanda, it is great to be here. We're super excited to share the good news of the Civility Effect, and we do want to send just a huge thank you to everybody who's on the workshop already. We hope you're going to walk away with a lot of really good information about how you can use civility and promote civil discourse in your personal and public lives.
Excellent. Thanks to folks, those of you who are chiming in the chat. It's great to see that we have some Omahans, Lincolnites, York, Scotts Bluff, so holding down the western edge of the state. Hastings, thanks for joining us, folks. Let's go ahead and move into our presentation here. Emerson, do you want to make a quick shout out about the pre-survey?
Sure can. I'm sure some of you received our email earlier today. We are conducting a pre-survey that's going to kind of help us measure the success of the workshop, you know, if and how your sentiments have changed before and after completing the training, and how equipped you feel to take on civil discourse before and after. Now, if you didn't get a chance to take that via the email earlier, it is going to be in the chat. So if you wouldn't mind, please just head over on there. It should only take you a few minutes, and it'd really help us out measuring, you know, what you all got out of this and whether or not what we're doing was successful in your minds.
Great.
So I'm just going to preview the Civility Effect a little bit for you all. As Steve and Amanda both said, we are the UNL-PRSSA Bateman team for 2021. This year's campaign is focused on promoting civility in public discourse, something that PRSA is obviously very interested in doing and having a stake in as we move forward, hopefully moving forward productively. So the Civility Effect as a whole can kind of be based around this one statement, which is much like the impact of knocking over a single domino, one civil or uncivil action can trigger a chain reaction that has the potential to move us forward toward a better self, healthier human relationships, and a more inclusive society. That is basically our big idea moving forward and into this workshop. So as you saw, the opportunity that we feel is presented with not only civility, but the Civility Effect is that as PR professionals, current and future, we do have the potential to lead that larger national conversation about reversing the corrosion of incivility in American life and bringing our collective expertise, insight, and influence to foster more effective and inclusive civil discourse in all aspects of life, whether it be your professional or your personal lives. By the end of this workshop, we hope that you have a better understanding of how you, as current and future PR professionals, have a stake in improving the state of civility. After this workshop, we hope you feel confident in your ability to have a dialogue with people who differ from you, as well as promote civility in the industry. As an extra incentive, the Civility Effect team will be giving away coffee gift cards to 7 lucky attendees with the hope that you will use what you've learned today to have a difficult but productive conversation over coffee, which is, of course, compliments of the team.
I love it. I think we can all appreciate coffee in an era where, gosh, we just need coffee and good conversations. Some common grounds, if you will. Let's find that. I'm already starting off with puns. Okay. As we get started into kind of the meat of our presentation, a quick, again, shout out about Civic Nebraska. We are a 501c3 nonpartisan nonprofit founded in 2008 by our executive director and founder, Adam Moorfeld. Adam, myself, and other students at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln were probably honestly just arguing about political things during our student government Wednesday night sessions when we decided that there was a lot of important work to be done in this realm, whether that was, again, voting rights, making sure that there was access to the ballot for all Nebraskans, and really creating that robust democracy and society that we benefit from as residents and citizens. So although we have come a long way from, again, ASUN Wednesday night arguments all the way up to 13th Street, where our current headquarters are, we're really pleased to be able to do this work in Nebraska and do it alongside many of you. So you can check us out at civicnebraska.org. Would love to, of course, have a conversation about any of our programs or opportunities with you. Again, we love the work that we do and we hope you find it valuable. So let's jump right in to our topic of conversation for today, civil discourse, or civility in PR especially. We pulled this to frame our discussion, we pulled this bit from the PRSA Code of Ethics because we thought it was particularly salient for our conversation and the work that we're hoping to do. One of the codes of ethics here is advocacy. And PRSA has declared that we serve the public interest by acting as responsible advocates for those we represent. We provide a voice in the marketplace of ideas, facts, and viewpoints to aid informed public debate. There are so many good things that are really encapsulated with this, especially that second sentence. The phrases that stand out to me about the work that you all do is that providing a voice in the marketplace of ideas and to aid informed public debate. You'll see similar themes in a couple of definitions of civil discourse later on today, but by all means know that this is a strong basis to start with for the work that, again, we're going to be doing today. First, I like to start with a little bit of context. Quite frankly, a lot of people have asked me and others at Civic Nebraska over the last handful of years, has it always been this bad? Has this been something, is this the worst it's ever been? So I pull out this piece from Ann Gerhardt, a Washington Post contributor, all the way back in 2009. And she calls upon history. And as a daughter of a history professor, I think it's important context. So you can see that a supporter of Thomas Jefferson once called John Adams a hideously hermaphroditical character. Certainly not civil words. And of course, we can see that the Alexander Hamilton-Aaron Burr rivalry ended up in a duel. And there's a whole Broadway musical about that. So we know, again, that civility or incivility in this case has been around since our founding as a nation and before that. But that second paragraph that Anne wrote, I think, is something to really take away with us today as we get into this work. As we go through the nation's history, the noise and the heat in public political discourse has always been there, rising with cycles of economic distress, immigration, and cultural upheaval. And as we look at 2020 and as we look towards the remainder of 2021, we certainly can assess and see that There was cycles of economic distress, cultural upheaval, a global pandemic. So we know that the conditions right now are certainly challenging and ripe for incivility. That's a fascinating example on kind of a national level, or thinking about our founding fathers and framers. But I also think it's worth looking at a Nebraska-based example. So what I have here, this is sourced directly from History Nebraska, our fantastic historical society in Nebraska. And I think this civility story, or incivility story, indicates that we've not always been Nebraska nice. So as you may know, Omaha was Nebraska's original capital city, but in January of 1858, Omaha's opponents had a clear majority in both houses of the territorial legislature. This was before Nebraska became a state. And so these opponents of the Omaha delegation planned to introduce a bill to allow for the selection of a new capital, a real power move by the South Platters. But of course, the Omaha legislators and their allies were not pleased about that and launched a filibuster, and ultimately that effort erupted into a fist fight on the House floor, legislative floor. So it certainly shows that, again, incivility has been around for a long time, not only on the national level, but on a state level as well, as we look at that, and of course, local levels. But however, I don't want you to think like, okay, Amanda's just telling us that it's inevitable. It's everywhere. It's been around from the beginning, because polarization certainly is real. When we look at the Pew Research Center and some of their findings over the course of their studies, we looked at the same study from 1994 and 2017. So in 1994, Pew Research Center did a study of 10 key issues, and they surveyed thousands of people, and they sorted the responses by a number of different kind of categories. One of those categories was ideology. And so the ideological point gap in 1994 on these 10 issues was 15% in 1994. In 2017, the point gap between when sorted by ideology was a 36-point gap, right? How far they were on those 10 key issues. So we know that it's only increasing. The polarization and the partisan gap is increasing. But the interesting thing that this same study found over time was that the partisan gap is higher than difference in opinions when you sort it by different demographics. So race, gender, age, education, and religion did not have that divisive of a gap, or that big of a chasm between different polls. So really what that tends for us to draw a conclusion to is that partisan identities are more divisive even than the position themselves on the issues, which should give you a little bit of hope, if not, and when you think of it in some ways. So, whoops. So, as you're thinking, why civil discourse? Why are we talking about it? We know kind of the context. What does the public relations profession have to do with it? When we look at this from a Civic Nebraska perspective, we think there's several key reasons to invest in civil discourse and dialogue. So without civil discourse, people shut down, and that's just at a base level. Conversations end often in distress, and relationships are damaged or avoided. And on that note of avoidance, it typically kills collaboration, which is a value that most of your brands or clients or organizations implicitly or explicitly embrace. So we know that avoidance doesn't help us lead to better product, better conversation, better democracy, right? We also know that without civil discourse, we lose the opinions and perspectives of others, and particularly minority voices. I know that the PR industry values diversity, equity, and inclusion, specifically because you can't create a place of belonging or even a strong message without perspectives of people of different backgrounds when they're not heard or acknowledged. So that's important. Similarly, without civil discourse, Only the loudest voice is the one that's either heard and or accepted. Again, that's not a proactive or positive way to handle a branding campaign. Loudest voice shouldn't always win, whether that's, again, in a PR campaign or in a classroom or in just general society. Without civil discourse, disrespect and even violence becomes the norm. Nobody would say they want that sort of culture, whether, again, at an organization with a brand or within a social group. None of that is acceptable. And truly, we believe that workplaces, families, social groups, organizations, and democracy overall suffers without civil discourse. So the old adage of you can talk about anything except religion and politics, that's not helping us anymore. And I think people have gotten a little bit too good, and they've let their civil discourse muscles atrophy, which is certainly something we need to reverse a trend. So as we look at this slide, think about you, your organization, and again, your client base as we think about your work as a communications professional. How does it apply? Here we are. Thought it might be helpful to have a baseline definition of civil discourse. This one, the Lincoln ladies of the Bateman team pulled this definition together in their work and their research. So as we discuss civil discourse in that term today, it's defined as the art of having and valuing the difficult conversations that move us forward towards a better self, healthier human relationships, and a more inclusive society. And you saw some of that in the very first slide where Emerson introduced the Civility Effect campaign. But something that we really liked about this definition, it's an art, right? We know that there's no particular perfect formula for a conversation. So it's certainly something where you have to engage your kind of reasoning, but also your intuition in a conversation like this. And of course, we know that these can be difficult conversations, but they move us towards a better self, human relationships, and a more inclusive society. There are other definitions, of course, out there. You could Google civil discourse all day long and find different definitions. But I think there are some interesting themes to pull out of any grouping of definitions. One is that civil discourse is usually a set of choices, right? You have to make the choice to enter into the conversation or make responsible decisions. We'll get into that in a little bit. We also see civil discourse as being principle-based. There are certain components, skills, or principles that underlie a civil conversation. Civil discourse is usually born of dialogue and deliberation. It doesn't happen without a two-way communication street, at least. And again, as communications professionals, I imagine that's of particular interest to you. Civil discourse has to advance the public interest. The example I always talk about is that we could have dialogue about whether or not cornbread or cinnamon rolls go better with chili. I'm not sure that it advances public interest. We could have a debate about that in a minute, but it needs to advance the public interest. So it can't be just frivolous conversation. And then civil discourse is usually an exercise or an ability. I kind of mentioned that it's a muscle that we have to practice in order to be better at it. And it doesn't mean that we're perfect at every step of the way or every conversation. It is a practice in many senses of the word. The Bateman team did a great survey of PRSSA members, both for college students and working professionals. And some interesting things when we asked them to say, well, what does civil discourse mean to you? Or what do you think it's defined as before we gave them this definition? And I thought several of the responses were interesting, and I wanted to share them with you. A lot of folks indicated that there was a respect theme, which goes beyond politeness. We'll get to that in a minute. One was kind of a fairness theme, that civil discourse applies the same standards to both sides of a disagreement. Right? There is no inequity in terms of one side versus the other. There was a lot of listening themes, showing a genuine intent and interest in listening and learning and being open-minded, and that certainly is captured in this. Someone wrote, knowing when and how to end the argument, which I thought was particularly fascinating. So kind of when to pull the parachute and say, we're done here, also a skill. Another one said, controlling one's negative emotions when engaged in a disagreement or debate. And again, we'll get to values of civil discourse, but emotional discipline is certainly a component of that art of having a conversation. And then a couple of others: recognizing hypocrisy, including one's own, and not making disagreements personal. So if you're wondering how your peers do in terms of thinking about and defining civil discourse, I think there's some really good source material to start with. There's a deep and broad understanding of civil discourse, what it is and what it isn't. So on that note, let's go to what it isn't. And I really can't emphasize this enough. Civility, or civil discourse, it does not merely mean politeness. It does not equal politeness, or even just simple tolerance. It's not a blanket opportunity to say inflammatory, morally wrong things and then just say, well, we got to be civil about it. It's not an excuse. It's not politeness. You can see Dr. Lundberg, a professor of rhetoric, said it more eloquently than I did, but it originates in ancient Greece. There's standards of conduct towards others, and that members of the civil society should comport themselves in a way that seeks the good of the city. So again, we're moving public discourse forward. We're thinking about the common good. We hold ourselves to certain standards of conduct. And that goes beyond politeness, right? It's not just mere politeness or tolerance. A couple of other notions that we found in that same survey of working PR professionals, some folks said it's just getting along with others, which is, again, not the case. You can appease people in a conversation and not be aiming at civil discourse, right? Not just keeping peace or being polite. Someone also said, like, having good social etiquette or having basic manners. And although that's perhaps a good start, it's more than that. So again, if you take one thing away from this today, is it's not simply being polite and appeasing. It's really about a standard of conduct that we hold ourselves and others to move public discourse forward. So you'll see we're putting two things side by side. I'm going to take the first slide here, and that's values of civil discourse. In its purest form, we believe that civil discourse embodies these values, or these skill bases. We actually developed these from a pilot civil discourse program at Dawes Middle School in 2017, and they've held up. Middle schoolers know what they're talking about, which has been a ton of fun. So sometimes civil discourse scholarship will list these as tools or tactics, but really these are very much the hallmark traits of conversations that aspire to civility. So kind of walking through them, obviously it has to be honest and fact-based. If you cannot start from a basis of reality and factual information, then the conversation is going to get off the rails. So oftentimes when we talk about civil discourse, we pair that immediately with media literacy. And we could have a whole conversation for days about media literacy. But it's important to be able to distinguish fact from fiction or falsities, and start there, to start from a place of facts. We also talk about civil discourse needs to be respectful in words, tone, and body language. Obviously, when you start throwing out bombs such as "you're an idiot," "a deplorable," it's simply going to devolve. The conversation is going to devolve very quickly. In terms of tone and body language, I'm not one to police those typically, but I often think of it, and I pull this a little bit from negotiation strategy as well. So if you're presenting a very closed kind of presentation, personal presentation, again, either with your body language or your tone, it's going to be harder. It's going to be an uphill battle. And my poor sister, I always use her as an example here. I know when she's in fight mode by the tone of her voice. And so if I'm talking to her about a tougher subject, I certainly know that fight mode is engaged, and it's just going to go a different direction. So whether or not it's your sister or not, sorry, Allison, we know that conveys something. Your personal presentation conveys something. Civil discourse needs to be curious and not hostile. It has to be deliberative and not combative. Similarly, there aren't winners and losers. So those three particular stars really go to, there's typically no one keeping score in a conversation off to the side. We might think that, but there's no one saying, oh gosh, Steve got that point. He really ran away with it. Or man, Amanda made a great point. She gets 5 stars today. So similarly, we have to seek to understand in our conversations, and that is most often done through active listening. Again, some themes that we heard in the PRSSA survey. The no winners and losers, really, that goes towards the notion that there are collective, we are a part of the same effort, right? If we're trying to advance the common good through our conversation, then the common good is all of us. So we're really not on teams, we're on one team. Again, civil discourse employs empathy, putting yourself or having the ability to understand what others are thinking or feeling, and employs that emotional discipline. And I recognize that these are all easier said than done in practice. When you kind of feel that heat start to rise, when you get passionate about a subject, it's not easy to have the emotional discipline to say, gosh, let me take a step back and think about this objectively. But the best conversations do. So again, easier said than done, but certainly a hallmark of a great conversation. And then finally, civil discourse takes responsibility for personal attitudes, words, and actions, knowing that your intent may not have been to harm or demean or act uncivil, but perhaps that was the impact. And so knowing that, taking responsibility for that impact is important. So, like I said, we wanted to put this side by side with the PRSA Code of Ethics, so you could kind of see and understand the overlap. And Ariel on the Bateman team is going to give you the intro of this. Ariel?
Hi, everybody. I'm Ariel. I'm on the Bateman team, as Amanda said, and I just wanted to show how the values of civil discourse share a lot of foundational aspects that the PRSA Code of Ethics has. And these are, by definition of the PRSA, the core values of the public relations profession, and they set the industry standard. These professional values are vital to the integrity of the profession as a whole. And each of all of the public relations professionals set an example for each other, as well as other professionals, by the pursuit of excellence with powerful standards of performance, professionalism, and ethical conduct. So I wanted to go through a few of these with you guys. So advocacy is we serve the public interest by acting as responsible advocates for those we represent. We provide a voice in the marketplace of ideas, facts, and viewpoints to aid informed public debate. And then honesty, which is almost exactly the same as one of the values of civil discourse, is we adhere to the highest standards of accuracy and truth in advancing the interests of those we represent and in communicating with the public. Independence, we provide objective counsel to those we represent. We are accountable for our actions. Loyalty, we are faithful to those we represent while honoring our obligation to serve the public interest. Again, that public interest portion is also key to the values of civil discourse. Expertise, we acquire and responsibly use specialized knowledge and experience. We advance the profession through continued professional development, research, and education. We build mutual understanding, credibility, and relationships among a wide array of institutions and audiences. And finally, fairness. We deal fairly with clients, employers, competitors, peers, vendors, the media, and the general public. We respect all opinions and support the right of free expression. And as you guys can see, the values of civil discourse share a lot of similarities with the PRSA Code of Ethics.
Thanks, Ariel, for walking us through that. That's great. I saw, as I took a breather, I saw in the chat there were some questions about that very first, let's go back to that very first value of civil discourse, which is honest and fact-based. I won't spend a ton of time on here just for the sake of our kind of flow here. But I think it's incredibly important that if there are people who do not agree on the facts, or as Todd, I believe you said in the chat, if they believe different fakes, but yet they believe they're an honest person, how do we approach an issue when those sides are far apart? And I think that's why honest and fact-based is honestly the very first one here, because you have to come to some shared understanding of what is factual. And if you can't do that, then at that point, the hope for like a productive or civil conversation that takes on a deeper meaning on this issue is going to be real difficult. So at that point, if you can't agree or come to a shared reality of again, what is a fact and what is not regarding this issue, then it's best to step back, reconsider whether that's try to find other sources, try to check in to see if that person has like, each done your research and whatever else that may be. But the shared reality component of that, I think, is the most important. And thank you for raising that question, because that is critical, and there's a reason that is at the very top of this list. Okay, great questions. Thanks for adding those to the chat. This is great conversation. Let's go to spheres of civil discourse. So as we think about where does civil discourse take place, right? Where does this play out? How does this play out? We've developed a list of 4 spheres of civil discourse. A lot of what we discuss today will be really in the interpersonal and public sphere, to an extent the social media sphere, but it's important to look at the characteristics of each of these spheres, simply to have a better understanding about how to move forward productively in them. And again, as we think about communications professionals such as yourselves, it's important to consider like the tactics and the strategies you may use in each of these spheres, because they're different. So let's start out with interpersonal. So the interpersonal sphere, sorry, let me go back, I apologize. The interpersonal sphere you can see is informal and verbal. Public is formal and verbal. Social media is informal and written or produced, and we'll get into that in a second. And then media or mass media is that formal and again, written or produced content. So we'll dive into each of these, or 3 of these 4 in a moment. So first up, interpersonal. These are informal conversations, right? There's no one keeping score. There's no rules necessarily governing. Robert's Rules of Orders don't necessarily apply when I'm talking to my colleague, Steve, my neighbor, Betsy. Nobody is governing those conversations. And oftentimes it's verbal, right? I'm sure there are probably interpersonal conversations that can play out via writing, but in today's day and age, it's often verbal. You typically have a relationship with the other person or persons in the dialogue. So it can be small group settings, it can be socially, one-on-one. That's where this sort of conversation or this sphere takes place. Really, what we found from the research is that interpersonal conversations and interpersonal dialogue often has the most potential to change hearts and minds. And again, it comes down to, that relationship, that willingness to listen and be open-minded in a conversation with, at the very least, someone you know. So that's, again, I think a potential opportunity or a possibility there. And in the most common setting, this is face-to-face and/or it involves nonverbal cues. So the one timeout or I would offer is that obviously during COVID, things are different via Zoom. I'm not having as many face-to-face conversations, unfortunately. That's right. Steve and I did have a mass conversation earlier today. It was magical. I haven't had an in-person meeting in a long time. So Steve, thank you for that. So it's a little bit different via Zoom, but again, you can still see my nonverbal cues. I get my talking with my hands from my mother. And so in that setting, you're still picking up on a handful of things. Steve's going to explain the public sphere.
Yeah, the public sphere is, I doubt that people watching along today probably need a lengthy description of the public sphere. But it is really important to our discussion today. So for the record, here it is. The public sphere is the area of social life where people come together freely to discuss and identify issues, right? And it's through this discussion that we influence societal action. Politics lives there, of course, and so does public debate. And that is right where public relations lives as well. So I'm not breaking any news with this group. Folks know this. But also, this public sphere is where what has been termed civil society. You've heard that term over and over, I'm sure. Civil society, where it is built. And so what is civil society? The way we define that is that's the people, the organizations, the businesses, movements, and so on that compete and cooperate to build democracy. So it's not a small thing. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute after we discuss the elephant in the room, which is social media. Amanda.
Great, thank you. Yeah, Carrie, I saw your question in the chat about guidance on moderating online civil discourse. So we'll get there here in just a moment. When we consider the characteristics of social media as a sphere of civil discourse, again, we see that it's informal. There's no moderator, there's no rules necessarily that govern. There's on some of the bigger tech platforms we're seeing now, there are some rules, obviously consistent with the First Amendment, which is great. But again, by and large, this is informal conversation, and it's either written or produced in produced content. So whether that's a video, a photo, etc., a poster, that sort of thing. So it's written or produced content. Social media is changing rapidly, but generally speaking, you have a tangential relationship with the other person in this dialogue, whether or not you know them in real life, whether or not they're a friend of a friend, or sometimes, if you're a part of even a group on Facebook or Twitter that has regular dialogue, you might just know them from their regular posting, right? So you have some sort of relationship, although it's tangential in some senses. It has limited potential to change hearts and minds. Again, what we're seeing from research is that you can read lots of things on social media platforms and it won't necessarily move the needle in terms of beliefs and ideologies. So again, not trying to indicate that this has no place in our public discourse, just saying that like the persuasion factor that occurs over time is going to perhaps be more difficult to achieve on social media platforms. It does have potential to harm, that much we've seen. And just by the nature of the platforms, it sometimes creates more conflict than resolution, right? There is no resolution specific hook. Whereas in an interpersonal dialogue, you might have the impulse to resolve conflict or differences in opinions or ideas because you are kind of beholden to that person, that relationship. That doesn't always exist here on social media. It's really designed to target emotions. Again, we know that about social media. It's designed to pull you in, keep you there, keep you scrolling or swiping. And of course, it's more difficult to accurately convey your thoughts and your feelings due to the nature of your platforms. So there's a high threshold for understanding the norms of these platforms. I'm old enough that I am not on TikTok, and if I needed to be able to accurately convey my thoughts on a topic of public importance, I would not go to TikTok because I have no idea how it operates, right? So there's sometimes a high threshold just due to the platforms themselves. So we recognize that a lot of incivility in our lives these days does stem from behavior that's encouraged by social media platforms. And when we think about social media in this space of PR professionals, we encourage you to think about the effect that you have as a professional communicator. So thinking about how your organization or your clients or choose to interact in this environment. And we'll get more into some of the strategies to Carrie's question about guidance on moderating civil discourse in a few minutes. But there are certainly some positives to the social media sphere. You can push out content to a wide variety of audiences, and you can use it as a way of combating misinformation, which is tremendous. So there's certainly, just because it's fast and unvetted, doesn't mean it's totally negative. Fast information, if it's accurate information, can also be a positive of the social media sphere. So lest you think I'm beating up on Zuckerberg and company, I promise I'm on those platforms, except not TikTok. I've already outed myself. So, all right. Steve, do you want to dive a little bit more into PR, social capital, and trust for us?
Sure. And let's just talk briefly about this, because social media, or excuse me, social capital, we're talking about social media, I got programmed to say it. Social capital and trust are just a fastball right over the plate for public relations. I want to talk a little bit about civil society, as we mentioned earlier, and how it is built on something called social capital. Now, social capital, you've probably heard this term. It became popular about 30 years ago, and it was coined by a sociologist named Robert Putnam. And essentially, what that is, and you can see the definition there on the screen, but it's the network of relationships among everybody that live and work in a given place, a given society. And so those networks over time power the society. They make it function. They tackle common issues. And ultimately, they move and fuel the society forward to make it thrive. So that's what social capital is. And it's the fuel that runs Nebraska. It's the fuel that runs Lincoln and Omaha in the United States. And of course, it does not appear out of thin air. There are lots of ingredients. PR pros, if you think about each of these elements and how you work to build them in large and small ways every day for your organization or for your clients, they'll look familiar to you in one way or another. Mutual trust. I don't need to explain how important trust is in the corporate world, in the communications world. If you have no credibility, your message is not going to be heard. Relationships, and most importantly, new cross-cutting relationships, a diversity or a plurality of views. And then last, of course, collective action towards common goals. It's important to note, I think, that these four elements contain activators of inclusivity as well. Cross-cutting relationships, and what I mean by that is connections at the intersections of different aspects of our society. These have the potential to create networks that are made up of different racial or ethnic or religious backgrounds in our society. And so that is a key one as we move forward for the long game of civil discourse. Amanda, go ahead and go to the next slide. So continuing this line of thought, it really is true that PR is a social capital builder. I use the baseball metaphor. It's a fastball right over the plate. It really is. For us in public relations, this is what we do. We provide and facilitate access to public conversations. We're knee deep in that public sphere, right? We build, we maintain social infrastructures, those communities of interest, right, that we all curate that matter to our organizations or to our clients. So the good news here is that these should look pretty familiar to us, because these are the core functions of public relations, or public relations when it is at its best, I should say. Eric Sommerfeld studies social capital and public relations. I believe he's still at the University of Maryland. If you have a chance, feel free to look him up, some of his work. I often return to his writing when I need to center my work in the pillars of social capital and civil discourse. First, he shares this self-evident fact that public relations is always at work in the public sphere. And second, I won't read the whole quote, I promise. He encourages us to consider public relations as beyond something besides just messaging. Now, we all know this deep down, but really what he tries to get at is relentless advocacy for our organizations and clients. So Sommerfeld frames PR primarily as community building, which I think is very powerful. And that's what we must do with that social capital we create. We can't just let the social capital sit there. We have to build with it. And I'd argue now more than ever, given the state of our discourse, it's really important to build community, and everything else kind of flows from there. Amanda, go ahead and go to the next slide. With an audience of professional communicators from a range of fields and sectors today, I'm not going to be too prescriptive for you. It would be insulting to your intelligence. And we're not going to suggest you need to tweet this way or issue public statements in that way. But it is worth saying that keeping civility and civil discourse top of mind while going about our work is paramount as we engage with today's public sphere. It is paramount. And what do I mean by that? Well, I guess as public relations practitioners, we individually are at our best when we can build those communities by helping people find the signal amid the noise. There's always that statement in market research that says today's generation, so it's the youngest generation that's just coming up, is the most marketed to generation in American history. I'm thinking back to the days when I was the most marketed generation, among the most marketed. That was 2 generations ago. So it's something to think about, the signal amid the noise. Customers, supporters of your organization or your clients, strangers, whoever, providing clarity and motivation amid all of the messages that people take in is a really valuable and increasingly important, I would say, role for folks who do what we do. So second, as professional communicators, it's not just our job to advocate for our clients and our organizations. It really is, here comes the heavy stuff, it's our democratic duty. It really is. And the bedrock foundation of advocacy is in clearly and professionally presenting a point of view. But I'll push back even a little bit on that last point, where it's important to say that being professional doesn't necessarily mean stripping your entire message of all of its personality, being a robot or over-sanitized or an empty, unemotional vessel on behalf of, for fear you might be taken wrong. We do have to hold authenticity and professionalism in balance, right? And we can use those tried and true methods of decorum and ethics to build trust, build new relationships, and build communities. Again, we're using our social capital. We're not letting it sit there. So essentially, each of us should be able to look to our organizations or our clients' values and objectives and communicate alongside of them, hopefully not in contrast to them. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Amanda. Just to kind of think a little bit more about this, any organization worth its salt is kind of doing this already. Maybe unconsciously, but they are doing it, right? They're in business because they saw a public need. They saw an opportunity in the economy, a way to improve people's lives. So their professional communication should flow naturally from those values. And as their PR practitioners, it's important for us to maintain this mindset, to keep it relentlessly top of mind in everything we do, and to continually monitor and evaluate what we're hearing in our interactions in the public sphere. There are a lot of sophisticated tools for this, but sometimes, frankly, it's a phone call or an email or a conversation, offhand remark that brings it all home for me. I guess the point is, no matter how big your platform, no matter what your venue is or how big your reach might be, it's still always going to be vital to listen and seek to understand. And that sounds simple, but it's not always so. It's really a bandwidth and a mindset challenge, right? But it is something to keep top of mind, something to remember that it's so essential. So the bottom line here, as I'm sure you've already deduced, is that civility and civil discourse are very wise PR practices, not only in a day-to-day sense, but in the long-term work of building a robust public sphere. And that's where we really snap into that larger democratic picture. It can be a lot of fun to deal in snark. I mean, it can, to be the irreverent, in-your-face, combative brand, right? I mean, maybe that is your brand. Maybe that's your client's brand or your organization's brand. That's great. And there may be, and I would concede there may be some value in being known for that one time you dunked on a challenger or a competitor, or destroyed a competitor. But ultimately, in any organization, sooner or later, the need for clarity, finding that signal in noise, for trust, for honest communication, that's going to win out. And even in a public sphere that may feel increasingly coarse and cluttered, I think that's what has been true will continue to be true. At the end of the day, I think the choice is still between short-term notoriety and long-term reputation. So yeah, here endeth my portion of the workshop. Amanda?
Beautifully said, Steve, thank you. In an effort to give us plenty of time to discuss in some breakout groups, I'll go through these strategies fairly quickly because, again, I don't think any of them are too complex or complicated. And to set a bit of context as we think about strategies, many of these happen interpersonally, and that simply might be the kind of the frame that I'm giving them in, but they can also be applied to our kind of professional communication efforts. So some strategies that we've seen that work well in civil discourse in these spheres. First up, that 3 parts of an argument, fairly basic in rhetoric scholarship, but there's an assertion, reasoning, and evidence. So assertion, that's your thesis statement, that's what you believe, what your main message of putting that out there. There's the reasoning, which is the because, right? Why do we make the assertion we make? What is our thesis founded on? It typically can be somewhat even simple, but a lot of times in civil dialogue, people fail to connect that assertion and the reasoning. And then, of course, people then go to very quickly to focus on the evidence, like, well, here's all the reasons why, or supporting the reasoning. So the basic form of evidence is an example. And I think we see that play out in a lot of public relations strategies. The evidence is almost like a client testimonial, right? This is the best experience I've had in my professional career. And personal examples work well, right? To explain why our worldview is the way it is. There's nothing wrong with an example, those personal truths. For some audiences, of course, facts, studies, and research certainly also helps and should be relied upon, again, in a factual and fact-based manner. So another strategy that we see if you're going back and forth in a scenario, again, either interpersonally or in the public sphere, is the 4-step refutation. So first up is that restate. There's power in paraphrasing, truly. It's when you concisely and fairly summarize the opposing argument. And I would say restating helps prevent things from getting off the rails at the very beginning. Because sometimes there can be a misunderstanding at the basic premise or the outset of an argument, right? So restating, making sure that you're using similar language to be on the same page is a really powerful move. Second step, of course, is to refute. So you state your objection or your difference in opinion there. So you're providing your counter argument. And then again, you're providing evidence or reasoning. Logical basis always wins the day, at least to begin with. And then finally, you conclude. And I think this is an important one. Again, whether we're speaking interpersonally or in the public sphere, but like demonstrating your ability to resolve 2 opposing ideas or to explain that even based on the conversation, here's where you land, exploring those commonalities, exploring where perhaps those differences diverge. That's really powerful in itself. It almost is a summary or a wrap up, and it provides, at the very least, even if it doesn't persuade the others in the conversation, it provides a basis for you to start from the next time, right? Because you've covered that ground already. And I think there's power in that. And finally, from rhetoric scholarship, we see the Harris maneuvers, which are super fun. Carrie, to go back to your long question ago about like monitoring or guidance for online civil conversation, if anything, I think these are some 4 maneuvers that could be helpful. So first is the illustrating maneuver, which you're looking to other texts or sources. Again, I added this here, point of caution, you can link, you can provide examples and evidence, but don't necessarily expect other people to read or research or absorb the information the same way you do. That takes more time. And just note that in our current kind of like gigabyte economy, time is of the essence. So if you're willing to put in the time to work through that evidence with folks, great. If that's simply not valuable for, you, your client, your organization, it may be best to move on. But another maneuver is authoring. So you can invoke, the expertise or status of others to support your point. Again, we see this happening a lot in professional communications. So-and-so endorsed us, so-and-so, uses our product. And it's almost like a guidepost or a kind of a lamp lit path for folks to say, like, hey, if you respect this person or their expertise or their knowledge, then it would follow that you would also think this or be open to this notion. So authoring is a great rhetorical maneuver, professionally or personally. We also see extending. I think that the most recent example I shared is of extending, which is taking the concepts to another level or a different application. I saw this a lot early on in the pandemic, was the notion of masks and mask wearing and how it positively impacts public health, and people equated it to seatbelt wearing, right? We wear seatbelts for our safety and the safety of others as well. So extending that to a different application is a good one. Or also extending it with a notion of, would it change your mind if you knew this? And to get to Todd's earlier chat comment, kind of that notion of your beliefs are entwined with your identity. And so if you're trying to tell someone that their beliefs are dumb or wrong, then you're almost, in some instances, attacking their identity. So I think the extending maneuver here works particularly well when those are deeply interwoven, right? So would it change your mind if you knew this, right? So you're offering that person an out to say, like, I don't think you're dumb, or I don't think you're wrong. Just consider this extra point that you may not have known. So that's a great one. And then, of course, countering. And you can see this come through here. So offering alternative narratives. So you may have been in that position based on what you knew then, but what about this? So those are some good opportunities. They don't always work. Of course, you can pick and choose in particular situations, but those are some maneuvers and kind of rhetorical maneuvers that may help when you're stuck in a conversation that doesn't seem to be going anywhere. Okay. Just simply because as much as we love talking to you, I think you get a lot of value from a shared discussion amongst you and your peers. So Steve is going to set up kind of the conversations that we'd love for you to consider in your breakout sessions.
So truly what I am doing is I am going to talk very deliberately while Amanda gathers up the folks who are participating so she can send us all into breakout rooms. But the breakout discussions, we've thrown a lot at you, right? But here are some thoughts to kind of bring it down to the ground level. Okay, so you may be sitting there going, yeah, but, I mean, my situation is this, or my situation's this. My employer would never blank. My client might not like. So let's talk about some of those challenges. What are some of your biggest challenges? The key word in this question is your, when practicing civil discourse in the public sphere. Not necessarily conversations over the dinner table, but ones that you do for work. How does civil discourse in PR differ from merely being professional, or does it? I think that's a really interesting question. Get kind of deep into the philosophy of that. Because a lot of what we've talked about is just being good PR people, right? The code of ethics says it right there. What are your and your clients' most powerful platforms? In other words, what tools do you have? Do a little asset mapping to raise civility in our discourse. And then, are there entry points that you have found successful? Are there new ones that you may want to try, but maybe have been encouraged or maybe just have been maybe a little tentative to try, so that you can actively raise the civility level of our community's discourse and take our community however you like. Some people would say, well, that's Lincoln. No, that's just wherever you're at, whatever position that might snap into. So those are the 4 questions. We'll put them in the chat as soon as we all break into groups here, and everybody should be able to see the same chat. And I don't know, Amanda, you all set? Okay, I got the thumbs up. So here we go.
Wonderful. Excellent. Bateman team, Lincoln ladies, at this point, in a moment of levity, after you've all gone deep in discussion with your colleagues, do you want to do the door prizes for coffee gift cards? Do you want to announce those?
Yeah, I can explain a little bit how that'll go down. We will reach out to you probably via email, just so we can organize delivery and figure out how we want to get you those gift cards. But that will be done at very latest, probably tomorrow afternoon. So keep an eye on your inbox. We should have all of your contact information from the signups, but be on the lookout for that.
Wonderful. Thanks, Emerson. We can all be hopeful for coffee, a little extra boost of caffeine in our day. Okay, as we wind down our time here today, again, thank you for going into those breakout groups and discussing. Anybody, would you like to share? I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Well, no, not quite. Would anybody like to share what surprised you in your conversations, or what questions were difficult to answer? What did you discuss in some of these breakout sessions? Feel free to unmute yourself and share or add to the chat. Whoops. Any shared struggles that made you say, gosh, I'm glad to hear you struggle with that too? Anything that you want to lift up?
Hey, I'm going to throw in two shout outs on the team I was in. So and again, I'm not a PR professional, so these were really good things to walk away with. One comment was, brands are hunkering down into avoidance. And I thought that was a very powerful kind of just understanding statement, because I think there's a lot of truth in there. And whether it applied or not, Monique brought forward this iron triangle, which I really liked the concept of, and it was victim, villain, I think hero or something, but it was just that ironclad triangle of almost her version of the bubble. So those were two really good concepts to start to get your head around. And then the third one that I kind of threw out was this. What I think is, we've got two movements occurring simultaneously. One movement is, again, this victim villainization, you're evil. And on the other hand, a movement towards altruistic business models and, overall general well-being. People are moving towards this concept of well-being, whether that's social well-being, mental well-being, physical well-being, financial well-being. You see this huge movements of people towards these well-being concepts. And they seem diametrically opposed. So maybe the opportunity is to grasp onto some aspects of the well-being movement and find a way to get civility baked into that. Was just a thought that came out in the dialogue. And I'm very good at synthesizing what other people say. So the team that I had was a very smart team. All I'm doing is echoing things back and kind of crystallizing the data. So they get a lot of credit. They were very, very bright, smart people.
That sounds tremendous. My goodness, to be a fly on the wall. Thank you for summarizing that for us. I appreciate it. I think the interesting thing too is, like, brands are shrinking back into avoidance. And if we go back towards the, without civil discourse, we avoid each other, and kind of that negative ripple effect that comes out of there. So I think you're right. That's a powerful baseline statement to understand what are brands doing and why is that going to be long-term not the best course of action. Avoidance leads to a lack of collaboration. Thank you. I also have never heard of the iron triangle before, so that's fascinating.
We had an interesting conversation on who decides what's professional. Dress, actions, all of that. Back in the day, it was older white men that decided what was professional, the suits, and the women in skirts and hose. So we got on that a little bit. But really, we think civil discourse and being professional is the same thing. No matter how you're dressed,
Interesting. Okay.
We
So
talked about just to piggyback on that really quick, our
great.
group talked about the changing role of public relations in the term professionalism. I use an example of, how to act professionally, maybe not how to appear, but how to act. And what we're learning is, boy, that definition is changing quickly.
Sorry, I don't mean to skip through a bunch of slides, but I was going back a little bit to those. One at some point, the PRSA Code of Ethics, and feels like professionalism is kind of woven throughout here. And you're right, that's perhaps another code name for civility. Interesting. Other thoughts, takeaways, areas of that you'd like to pursue next?
This is just in regard to one of the comments that just popped up on the chat about empathy. That's something that I think is a very good valid point. I believe it was Heather's. I'm not real good at this Zoom stuff and whatever, but I think that's something that's really an issue. I've always been a pretty empathic person in conversations and stuff, even to the point of arguing in the favor of the side that I'm not on, just to get other people to understand what's going on. But I think that is something. There's some people, empathy can't be taught, and unless you're willing to have a certain amount of empathy, it puts a big block in a conversation to get anywhere.
Absolutely. Sorry, I had to unmute there for a second. I would also say to the notion that it can or can't be taught, one thing that we're seeing in some of our youth civic leadership work is that social emotional learning can be taught, right? To connect people to the social emotional. And even if you can't teach empathy specifically, like listening and intent to understand, and a social emotional understanding can be helped. Also, my toddler has arrived to this presentation, so welcome. Not civil at the moment. Any more final? Yes, Lynn saying it's more difficult to think about professionalism in a world while working remotely. Absolutely, that's difficult, right?
On this idea of empathy that came up in our group too. Can empathy be taught? Everybody has had pain or difficult time in life. I think learns empathy at that point, because once you go through a painful experience, then that brings in civility. But I think it allows you to see that this person that disagrees with me, I can see that, recognize there may be some hurt and pain in their life, right? That kind of makes it's often said people connect more on your weaknesses together than they do on your strengths. And I think there's something to that, and empathy ties into that because it allows us to, see it from the other person's point of view, because maybe we've been there and they're not there yet. So I'll just add those two things.
That may be the challenge of our age, Dave, because of social media, and I think that may have rewired some of what the way we interact, in the public sphere and interpersonally, because Amanda and I described it as social media, two heavyweights standing in toe to toe in the ring and just throwing haymakers at each other, and nobody ever falling down. And that's. There's just not a lot of nuance, or there's just not a lot of, I guess, room to give in that situation. So there's not going to be room for empathy on that, and that's what's bleeding into a lot of real world discussions, so to speak, if we still have them after March 2020.
Okay, as we wrap up, that sounded like fascinating and fantastic discussion. So I hope it provides a jumping off point for you, your peers, that sort of thing, as you look to continue here in the future. So if you're wondering what can you do after you think through all of the incredible discussion and content we've covered today, what can I do professionally or personally or collectively? Of course, our amazing Lincoln ladies, the Bateman team, has created a Civility Pledge and created an ambassador hub on their website. So Please, we would love to see a widespread civility pledge taken by you, your peers, your colleagues, all of those folks. So go ahead and visit the civilityeffect.org. You can pledge there. There is a Google form link as well, so you can send that on, again, to peers that maybe didn't attend today. You can also see it there in the chat. And then by doing so, you'll receive a Civility Pledge certificate via email, which is a really exciting thing. Again, this is a positive ripple effect kind of effort, then it will depend on ambassadors like you all. And based on what I heard in those discussions, you certainly have them. If you're interested in some of the civility resources, just know that, of course, we draw upon other scholars and practitioners in this field. So you can see a deck on this deck here, Essential Partners, the Better Arguments Project. Some of those entities are working really hard to raise the level of civility in our world, in our society. So not necessarily.
I lost sound for you, Amanda.
Let's try that again. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Thanks, Monique. As you look at some of these partners, certainly feel free to pick and choose and again, share with folks in your life. And then if you're interested in some longer reading, there's a couple of book suggestions that have formed kind of my perspective on civility and civil discourse. So last call, don't forget to take the post survey. We'll drop that in the chat and you'll also probably get it in your inbox.